January 1883. A 2-4-year-old fisherman is sitting in a 20-foot open boat in the North Atlantic. His mittens went overboard an hour ago. He knows his hands will freeze solid in minutes, and a man with frozen hands is dead weight. So he picks up the oars, wraps his fingers around the wooden handles, and holds them there until the flesh freezes permanently into claws. His dorymate is dead in the stern. The nearest land is 60 miles away. He begins to row. He will row for 5 days. This is not the most extraordinary thing about Gloucester, Massachusetts. It is the most ordinary. Over the course of 150 years, more than 10,000 men sailed out of this one small town and never came back. Not to war, not to disease, to fish. They sailed to the most dangerous fishing grounds on earth, in wooden boats barely wider than a dining table, into fog so thick a man could not see his own hand, into storms that swallowed entire fleets overnight. And they did it again and again and again, because the fish were running and the money was needed. This is the story of the deadliest job in history, and of the town that kept sending its sons to die. To understand why men accepted these odds, you have to understand one fish, the Atlantic cod. When John Cabot crossed the Atlantic in 1497, he reported that the waters off Newfoundland held so many cod they could be scooped up in baskets. That was not an exaggeration. The Grand Banks, a vast underwater plateau 200 miles off the coast of Newfoundland, where the cold Labrador Current met the warm Gulf Stream, teemed with life. Cod were everywhere, dense as a living carpet on the ocean floor, some weighing over 100 pounds. By the 1600s, salt cod had become one of the most traded commodities on earth. Dried, salted, and packed in barrels, it could survive months of shipping without spoiling. It fed the sugar plantations of the Caribbean, the Catholic markets of southern Europe, and the growing cities of the eastern seaboard. Cod was not just food, it was currency. The carved wooden codfish that still hangs in the Massachusetts State House is there for a reason. Cod built New England. Gloucester was perfectly positioned. Sitting on Cape Ann, north of Boston, it offered deep harbors, sheltered coves, and a straight run northeast to the Banks. By the 1860s, cod prices skyrocketed and the town exploded. Wharves lined every inch of waterfront. Sail lofts, rope walks, net makers, bait shops, outfitters, and salt importers packed the streets. The scent of dried fish and oakum hung over the town like a permanent fog. At its peak, Gloucester was the largest commercial fishing port in North America, home to more than 400 schooners and thousands of men whose only trade was the sea. The money was real. A good trip to the Banks could pay a doryman the equivalent of 6 months' wages in 3 weeks. A skipper who knew the grounds and had a fast vessel could make his crew wealthy, but the money came with a condition. You had to go where the fish were. And the fish were 200 miles offshore, on banks swept by the most violent weather in the North Atlantic. The schooners that carried these men were built in the shipyards of Essex, Massachusetts, which launched more two-masted schooners than any place in the world. They were designed for speed and cargo, not for safety. Wide and flat-bottomed to hold the maximum weight of salted fish, they carried rigging that reached high and stretched forward to a long bowsprit. The result was a ship that moved fast under full sail, but turned dangerously top-heavy in rough seas. The same hull shape that maximized profit maximized the chance of capsizing. But the cod fishery was not only an American affair. The Grand Banks had been contested by European fleets since the 1500s. Portuguese, French, Basque, and English fishermen had all worked these waters long before Gloucester existed. By the 19th century, the competition was fierce. French banking schooners from St. Malo and Fécamp sailed thousands of miles each season. Portuguese White Fleet vessels, the famous Frota Branca, departed from Lisbon every spring, their crews spending 6 months on the Banks, in conditions that made even Gloucester men wince. The international competition drove prices and pushed captains to stay on the grounds longer, fish harder, and take greater risks. The crewing of a Gloucester schooner was its own kind of gamble. Most dorymen were paid on a share system, not a salary. The vessel owner, took a percentage off the top. The captain took his cut. What remained was divided among the crew based on each man's catch. A good trip might pay $200 per man. A bad trip, weather too rough, fish not running, gear lost in a storm, might pay nothing. You could spend 3 weeks on the North Atlantic, risk your life every day, and come home with empty pockets. The men who accepted these terms were not fools. Many of them had no alternative. Gloucester's dorymen came from everywhere: Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, Portugal, the Azores, Scandinavia, Ireland. They were immigrants and sons of immigrants, men with no land, no education, and no trade, except the one that might kill them. The waterfront boarding houses were full of young men waiting for a berth, and a captain who lost a crewman could replace him within the hour. A typical trip ran like this. The schooner would leave Gloucester loaded with ice, salt, barrels of bait herring, and enough food and water for 3 weeks. The crew, usually 16 to 20 men, would sail northeast for 2 or 3 days until they reached the banks. The captain would take soundings with a lead line, a weighted rope with a hollow at the bottom filled with tallow, which picked up samples of the sea floor. He would feel the bottom for the coarse gravel and broken shell that signaled cod habitat. Once he found his spot, he would anchor the schooner. And then the real work began. Stacked on the deck of every Grand Banks schooner were 8 to 15 flat-bottomed boats, each one roughly 20 feet long and barely 5 feet wide. These were dories, and they were the fisherman's office, his lifeline, and often his coffin. Designed to nest one inside another for easy storage, dories were light, cheap, and expendable. They had no keel, no deck, no cabin. Just an open hull, a pair of oars, and whatever a man brought with him. Before dawn, the captain would give the order. The dories were swung over the side by block and tackle, lowered into the black Atlantic, and each crewed by 1 or 2 men. They would row out from the schooner, sometimes a mile or more, to set their trawl lines. Long ropes stretching a quarter mile, with hundreds of baited hooks every 6 feet. Each hook was baited by hand with a whole herring, the men working in the dark with numbed fingers, the dory rocking in the swell. Once the line was set and anchored by buoys, they would wait. Then they would haul it back in, hand over hand, pulling each hook and its catch-up from 20 fathoms below. The work was brutal. A full trawl line of halibut or cod could weigh hundreds of pounds. The men hauled it with bare hands, the hooks slicing through wet skin, the rope burning across their palms. Every fish had to be unhooked, gutted, and stacked in the bottom of the dory. A loaded dory sat dangerously low in the water, its gunwales only inches above the surface. One rogue wave could swamp it. But the greatest danger was not the work, it was the weather. The Grand Banks sit at the collision point of the Labrador Current and the Gulf Stream, 2 massive bodies of water at vastly different temperatures. When they meet, they produce fog. Not ordinary fog, but walls of gray so thick that a man in a dory could not see his own hand at arm's length. The banks are fog-bound more than 100 days a year. Imagine this. You are alone in a 2-0-foot open boat somewhere on the open Atlantic, 200 miles from the nearest land. You left the schooner at dawn. The weather was calm. Now, 3 hours later, a fog bank has rolled in so dense that the ocean and the sky have become the same shade of gray. You cannot see the schooner. You cannot see the other dories. You cannot see the sun to know which direction is which. You have a compass maybe, and a tin horn to blow. You row in the direction you think is right, but the current has shifted, and every stroke takes you further from the ship. This was the scenario that killed more dorymen than any storm, getting lost in the fog. The schooner had no engine. It could not come looking for you. The captain would ring a bell, fire a gun, blow a horn, but sound travels strangely in fog. A man a quarter mile away might hear nothing. A man a mile away might hear a gunshot and row toward it, only to find himself further from the ship than when he started. The currents of the Grand Banks are deceptive. A doryman who stopped rowing for even 30 minutes could drift a mile without knowing it. If the fog held for a day, 2 days, 3, you drifted, without food, without fresh water, without shelter from the wind and spray. Dehydration set in first. Then the hallucinations. Then the cold. If a passing vessel did not spot your tiny hull, and the chances of that were nearly zero, you died of exposure, thirst, or drowning when the dory finally swamped. Some men were found weeks later, still sitting upright in their dories, frozen solid, their hands still gripping the oars. And there was another terror the doryman knew well. The Grand Banks were one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world. Massive transatlantic steamers, 500 feet long, traveling at 15 knots, cut through the fog at full speed, their crews unable to see or hear a 20-foot boat until it was directly under the bow. A steamer hitting a dory did not slow down. The crew likely never even felt the impact. The fisherman's own book, a handbook for schooner fishermen published in 1882, carried this grim warning. Many of the fishing vessels which disappear so mysteriously are run down by steamers while at anchor on the banks. No wreckage, no survivors, no explanation. Just a name added to the memorial wall. In 1898 alone, 63 Gloucester fishermen were lost. That was not an unusual year. When the dories returned to the schooner, the day was not over. It was only beginning its second act. The fish had to be processed immediately. On a salt banker, the routine was as precise as any factory floor. The catch was hoisted from the dories onto the deck. A man called the throater made the first cut, slicing the fish's throat and belly open in one clean stroke. Next came the header, who ripped out the guts and tore off the head in a motion so fast it looked like a magic trick. The splitter took the carcass and ran his blade down the backbone, opening the fish flat like a book. The backbone was yanked out and tossed into a barrel. Everything was saved. Cod livers went into a separate tub for oil. Cod tongues were cut out and counted 1 tongue per fish, the traditional method of tallying each man's share of the catch. Below deck, the salter packed the split fish in layers, alternating salt and flesh, filling the hold inch by inch. A good salter was an artist. Too little salt and the fish would rot before the schooner made port. Too much and the product would be ruined, the flesh tough and unsellable. The salt came from Sicily, Cadiz, or Liverpool, imported by the ton and stored in Gloucester's waterfront warehouses. The men worked through the evening and into the night by the light of whale oil lanterns swinging from the rigging. There was no set schedule. When fish were running, you processed fish. Sleep happened when it happened, often in wet clothes, crammed into a forecastle barely tall enough to sit upright. Bunks were wooden shelves lining the hull, 6 inches of straw between a man and the planking. The air below deck was thick with the smell of fish, salt, sweat, and bilge water. Meals were cooked by the ship's boy in a cast-iron stove bolted to the deck. Salt pork, hard biscuit, beans, tea. On a lucky day, fresh fish fried in cod liver oil. Water was rationed from wooden casks. On a long trip it went stale and green, but you drank it anyway. Medical care was non-existent. If a man sliced his hand open on a hook, he wrapped it in a rag and kept working. If he broke an arm, hauling a trawl line, the captain set it with a splint made from barrel staves. If infection set in, there was no doctor, no medicine, no hospital. The nearest medical facility might be in 1 8-hour sail to the Norwegian coast or a port in Newfoundland. Many men died of injuries that would have been treatable on shore. And then there were the storms. A gale on the Grand Banks was not like a storm on land. It was a moving wall of water, with waves that could reach 40 or 50 feet tall, enough to look down onto the deck of a schooner from above. The wind would hit 60, 70, 80 knots, shredding sails and snapping masts like matchsticks. The schooner would pitch and roll, her rigging screaming in the wind, the hull groaning with every wave impact. The dories lashed to the deck would break loose, becoming projectiles that killed men as easily as the sea itself. Crewmen on deck were swept overboard by waves they never saw coming, green water crashing over the rail with the force of a collapsing building. The same flat-bottomed hull that carried all that profitable fish made the vessel unstable in heavy seas. A schooner loaded with salt cod rode low and sluggish. If a wave caught her at the wrong angle broadside, with the wind on her beam, she would roll and never come back up. The crew had no time to react. One moment you were gripping the rail, The next you were underwater, the ship above you, the keel pointing at the sky. Winter storms were the worst. Water temperature on the Grand Banks in January dropped below 35 degrees Fahrenheit. A man overboard in those conditions had 10 minutes of useful consciousness. After that, the cold shut down his muscles and his mind. Rescue, if it came at all, had to happen in minutes. It almost never did. In the great gale of February, 1879, 14 Gloucester schooners went down with 157 men. No survivors from any vessel. No one knows exactly how they died. It is assumed the ships were tumbled over and over in the ocean until they broke apart, leaving their crews to drown in the freezing dark. When the storm passed and the surviving vessels returned to Gloucester, the waterfront was lined with women and children, scanning every mast, every flag, every figure on every deck. Some found their husbands. Some found empty berths. Of all the thousands who sailed from Gloucester, one story captures the full horror and defiance of this life better than any other. It is the story that opened this video. In January 1883, Howard Blackburn, a 24-year-old Nova Scotian, signed on to the schooner Grace L. Fears for a winter halibut trip to the Burgeo Bank, off the southern coast of Newfoundland. Halibut brought the highest prices, but the grounds were far, the water deep, and the winter brutal. On January 25th, the captain ordered the men out in their dories to haul trawl lines. A storm was building, and he wanted the gear aboard before it hit. Blackburn and his dorymate, a young Newfoundlander named Thomas Welch, rowed out into a calm but bitterly cold morning. They set their 300 hook-long line, baited with whole herring, and began hauling. Within hours, the sky turned black. A blizzard swept in. The schooner vanished behind a wall of snow and spray. The two men were alone on the open North Atlantic in a 20-foot dory. They rigged a drag anchor from a keg to hold the bow into the waves and began bailing. The water poured in faster than they could throw it out. Then Blackburn's mittens went overboard. A wave washed everything loose in the bilge to the stern, and the heavy fisherman's gloves went over the side with the slush. Blackburn knew exactly what this meant. Without mittens, his hands would freeze solid within the hour. And a man with frozen hands cannot row, cannot bail, cannot help. He would become cargo. So he made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He picked up the oars. Slowly, deliberately, he wrapped his fingers around the wooden handles and held them there. In 20 minutes, his hands had frozen into claws, locked permanently around the oar grips. He would never open them again. For 2 days, the storm raged. They took turns bailing Blackburn using his frozen hook hands to grip the scoop. On the second evening, a wave broke over the dory, half filling it. Blackburn told Welch it was his turn. Welch did not move. "I can't see," he said. Blackburn showed him his ruined hand, the little finger hanging by a strip of skin. He immediately regretted it. Welch looked at the hand and said, "Howard, what is the use? We can't live until morning. Might as well go first as last." Blackburn refused. He bailed the boat alone. Before dawn, Thomas Welch was dead. His body slumped into the stern sheets, stiffened by the cold. Blackburn did not push him overboard. The dead man's weight served as ballast, keeping the dory stable in the following seas. Blackburn began to row. He estimated the coast of Newfoundland was 60 miles to the north. With no food, no water, his hands frozen to the oars, and his dead companion in the stern, he rowed. The friction of the oar handles wore through the frozen flesh on his palms, exposing raw tissue underneath. Salt water splashed into the open wounds with every stroke. He did not stop. He could not have stopped even if he wanted to. His hands were locked to the wood. He rowed through the day. The sun, when it appeared through the overcast, gave him a rough sense of direction. North. Always north. At nightfall, he put out the drag anchor and lay in the bilge beside the body of Thomas Welch. Sleep came in fragments. The cold woke him every few minutes, and each time he woke, he had to confirm that he was still alive, that his heart was still beating, that his feet could still move, that the dory was still afloat. At dawn, he hauled the drag and rowed again. His lips were cracked and bleeding. His tongue was swollen from thirst. The skin on his face was raw from wind and salt spray. But his arms still worked, and the frozen claws that had once been his hands still gripped the oars. He rowed through the second day, and the third. On the fourth day, he sighted land. A dark line on the horizon that might have been cloud, but was not. It was the coast of Newfoundland. He rowed toward it with everything he had left. On the fifth day, he pulled into the mouth of a river on the southeast coast of Newfoundland, spotted a fisherman's hut, and collapsed on the shore. He had rowed approximately 100 miles in 5 days, alone, with no hands, no food, no water, and a dead man for company. A local family took him in. They nursed him through the winter with poultices of flour and cod liver oil, the only medicine they had. He lost all his fingers, both thumbs to the first joint, and several toes. Thomas Welch was buried in the village cemetery when the ground thawed in spring. A year later, Howard Blackburn returned to Gloucester. The town had given him up for dead. They were half right. His hands were gone, but his nerve was not. The people of Gloucester raised $500 to help him start over. He opened a tavern on Main Street. Then, because a man with no fingers who had rowed 5 days through the North Atlantic with a corpse for company was apparently not finished testing himself, he sailed solo across the Atlantic twice. The first time, in 1899, he reached England in 62 days. 2 years later, he made it to Portugal in 39, setting a record. They called him the Man of Iron. He died in 1932. His funeral procession filled Main Street. Howard Blackburn survived. Most did not. The numbers from Gloucester are staggering, even by the standards of the 19th century. In 1862, a single gale killed 120 men and sank 15 vessels. In 1871, 19 vessels and 140 men were lost. In February 1879, 14 ships and 157 men disappeared in 1 month. The Portland gale of 1898 destroyed 150 vessels along the New England coast and nearly wiped out the entire Gloucester fleet. In one 60-year stretch in the 1800s, nearly 4,000 men from this one town died at sea. To put that in perspective, Gloucester's population in 1880 was around 19,000. In some years, the town lost 1 inch every 50 adult men. Entire families were wiped out in a single voyage. There are gravestones in Gloucester's cemeteries that list father and son lost on the same vessel, in the same storm, on the same night. Some families lost 3 generations to the sea. The widows walked the widows' walks, the rooftop platforms built on Gloucester houses so wives could watch the harbor for returning sails. Some women watched for months. Some watched forever. A schooner was expected back on a certain date, and when that date passed without a sail on the horizon, the waiting began. A week late might mean bad weather or poor fishing. 2 weeks late might mean the captain had sailed further than planned. 3 weeks, a month, and the women began wearing black. There was no official notification, no telegram from the Navy, no uniformed officer at the door. You simply stopped waiting. The town developed a kinship with loss that shaped everything about it. The churches that held memorial services every season, the businesses that sold coffins on Western Avenue, the widows' funds that paid out $500 or less to a dead man's family, raised from the pockets of the men who had survived. Children grew up fatherless so routinely that the school system developed a quiet protocol for it. After each disaster, there were cries for reform, safer boats, better navigation, mandatory life jackets, and after each disaster, the fleet sailed again, almost unchanged. The schooners were still built for speed and cargo, not for stability. The dories were still open and undecked. The men still went out in fog, in gales, in winter storms because the fish were running and the money was needed. The fishing industry did not decline because it became safer. It declined because the fish ran out. By the early 1900s, overfishing and the arrival of steam trawlers, which could drag massive nets across the sea floor, began to deplete the banks. The age of the Dory schooner was ending. The last of the great Gloucester Dory schooners, the Adventure, made her final trip in 1953. She is preserved today as a museum ship. Her empty dory racks a silent reminder of the men who once launched from her deck into the fog. In Gloucester, Massachusetts, there is a bronze statue of a fisherman gripping a ship's wheel, his eyes fixed on the open Atlantic. Carved into its base are 4 words: "They that go down to the sea in ships." Behind the statue, etched into the stone of a memorial wall, are names. Thousands of them. Every year, new names are added to the wall. The sea has never stopped taking. But if you stand where the bronze fisherman stands and look out past the breakwater, past the harbor buoys, past the lobster boats heading for the morning set, you are looking at the same ocean that swallowed 10,000 men from this one town. Men who sailed knowing the odds. Men who rode into the fog and never rode back. Men who built an industry, fed a nation, and paid for it with everything they had. And somewhere on the Grand Banks 200 miles out, in water so cold it stops your heart in minutes, the cod are still there. The fog still rolls in, and the ocean still does not care. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts below.